What happens when a promise made by something that should not exist comes due? On the night of July 29, 1937, beneath a darkening Tennessee sky, a group of young people gathered near a limestone cliff in Adams, their laughter echoing across the rock quarry as they roasted wieners over an open fire. They were from the local Epworth League, good Christian youth who'd grown up hearing the stories their grandparents whispered on front porches. Stories about Kate. Stories about the thing that once tormented a family so completely that it drove a man to his grave and left a community scarred for generations. But these were modern times now, 1937, the age of radio dramas and Hollywood pictures. The Great Depression had taught them that real monsters wore suits and foreclosed on farms, not that they hid in caves making promises to return from beyond the grave. So they joked, they laughed, they dared each other to call out her name. And then someone saw her. Sitting atop the cliff overlooking the cave, silhouetted against the summer night, was the figure of a woman. Not moving, just watching. The laughter died in their throats. One by one, they ran, stumbling over rocks and roots, their hearts hammering against their ribs as they fled toward the road to town. A minister in their group, a man of God and reason, stayed behind. He climbed that cliff, determined to prove it was nothing more than moonlight playing tricks on frightened minds. But when he reached the spot where the figure had sat, he found nothing. No rock formation that could cast such a shadow. No explanation that would satisfy logic. And according to the newspaper report filed days later, the moon that night had been barely visible at all. The minister caught up to the fleeing youth on the dusty road back to Adams. They expected him to calm their fears, to tell them what he'd discovered. Instead, they saw something in his eyes they'd never seen before. He had no explanation, none at all. This wasn't supposed to happen, not in 1937, not in the modern age. But 120 years earlier, in January of 1817, something had begun in these same Tennessee hills that defied every rational explanation, then, just as it defies explanation now. And before it departed in 1827, before it released its grip on the Bell family and vanished into the darkness of that cave, it made a promise that it would return. In exactly 110 years. In 1937. This is the story of what happened when America's most famous ghost story refused to stay buried in the past. This is the story of how a community held its breath for an entire year, caught between skepticism and terror, between the modern world and something far older. This is the story of the Bell Witch reappearance. And it begins not with what happened that summer night in 1937, but with understanding what first came to Adams, Tennessee in 1817, and why it never truly left. Adams, Tennessee. Population 624 souls, give or take, depending on who's counting and what year you're asking about. A tiny farming community tucked into the northwestern corner of Robertson County, where the Red River winds its way through limestone hills before emptying into the Cumberland. In 1937, Adams was the kind of place where everybody knew everybody's business, where church bells marked the passage of Sundays, where the same families who'd settled the land in the 1790s still worked tobacco fields their great-grandfathers had cleared from virgin forest. The kind of place where history didn't just live in dusty books, but walked alongside you down dirt roads, whispered from front porches, and refused to stay buried no matter how many years passed. The land itself tells the story. Robertson County, named for James Robertson, the explorer and founder of Nashville, they called the father of Middle Tennessee, had been carved out of the wilderness in 1796, the same year Tennessee achieved statehood. The Red River Baptist Church, one of the first churches founded west of the Cumberland Plateau, was constituted in Adams on July 25, 1791, making it older than the county, older than the state itself. This was frontier territory once, where settlers pushed westward into what the Spanish called the Miro District, negotiating with native peoples and Spanish governors for the right to farm this fertile bottomland. By 1937, that frontier had long since closed, but the old ways persisted. Tobacco remained king, just as it had been since the 1820s, when planters discovered that Robertson County's soil and climate produced what they called the world's finest dark-fired tobacco. The Great Depression had hit Tennessee hard, harder perhaps than the rest of the nation, because for rural Tennesseans, hard times had started long before Black Tuesday. Agricultural prices had collapsed after World War I ended in 1918. The longest drought on record scorched the fields. Banks failed. The Springfield woolen mills, once the pride of the county, had closed its doors. Young people fled to Nashville, to Memphis, to northern industrial cities like Chicago and Detroit, chasing jobs that might or might not exist. Those who remained in Adams lived close to the bone, stretching every dollar, trading labor for goods, relying on neighbors and kin networks that stretched back generations. But they endured. They always had. In the summer of 1937, Adams had one general store, a handful of churches, a volunteer fire department, and Route 41 running through its heart, connecting Springfield to the southeast and Guthrie, Kentucky to the northwest. It had farms where families rose before dawn to tend tobacco that would be sold at auction in Springfield. It had the old Nashville-Clarksville Road, rutted and dusty, where wagons had once carried goods between frontier settlements. And it had the Bell property, about 2 miles south of town, where John Bell had built his farmhouse in 1804, and where, 13 years later, something had arrived that defied every rational explanation the 19th century could muster. The Bell family story was woven into the fabric of Adams like thread through linen. Every child growing up in Robertson County heard it. Every Sunday school teacher cautioned against it. Every front porch storyteller embellished it. The tale of how John Bell, a respected farmer and God-fearing man, had witnessed a strange creature on his property in the autumn of 1817, something that looked like a dog with the head of a rabbit, something he'd shot at and missed, something that vanished without a trace. How the noises had started that very night, knockings and scratchings that progressed to voices, to physical attacks, to an invisible entity that could speak and reason and declare its intentions with chilling clarity. How this thing, this spirit, this witch, had tormented the Bell family for 4 years, focusing its rage on John Bell himself and his youngest daughter, Betsy, a beautiful girl of 12 when the haunting began. How it had beaten Betsy unconscious, yanked her hair, slapped her face until neighbors could see the red marks appearing on her skin from invisible hands. How it had interfered with her courtship, driving away her beloved Joshua Gardner with threats and torments until Betsy, exhausted and terrified, broke off their engagement. How hundreds of people had camped on the Bell property, bearing witness to phenomena that defied belief. Intellectuals and skeptics and men of science who came to disprove the legend and left shaken, unable to explain what they'd seen and heard. And how John Bell had died on December 20th, 1820, found in his bed with a vial of strange liquid beside him, a liquid that killed the family cat when they tested it. How the voice, the witch's voice, had sung drunkenly at his funeral, celebrating its victory, declaring that it had accomplished what it set out to do. Tennessee became the only state in the Union to officially recognize a death caused by supernatural means. That alone should tell you something about how seriously people took this. But the story didn't end with John Bell's death. The entity had made promises before it departed in 1821. It told Lucy Bell, John's widow, that it would return in 7 years. And according to those who remained on the property, according to Lucy and her sons Richard Williams and Joel, it did return in February 1828, manifesting in much the same way it had the first time, with shaking beds and unexplained noises. But this second visitation was brief, a whisper of its former fury, and it vanished again after a few weeks. Before it left, it made one final promise. It would return again, it said, to haunt the descendants of John Bell. In exactly 107 years, in 1935. Or was it 1937? The details varied depending on who told the story, which version of the legend you heard, whether you trusted the account published by Martin V. Ingram in 1894, or the oral traditions passed down through Bell family descendants. But everyone in Adams knew the promise had been made. Everyone knew the appointed time was approaching. And in the summer of 1937, as young people from the Epworth League gathered at the Bell Witch Cave for an innocent wiener roast, as they joked and laughed and dared the darkness to show itself, the question hanging in the thick Tennessee air was simple and terrible. Would she keep her word? Before we go deeper into what happened that summer night, we want to hear from you. This story belongs to Adams, Tennessee, but ghost stories, legends, and unexplained encounters exist everywhere. What about where you're from? Drop a comment below and tell us what city or town you're watching from. Do you have your own local legend? Your own haunted history that refuses to stay buried? We'd love to know. Now, let's return to 1817, to the beginning of it all, because you can't understand what returned in 1937 without first understanding what arrived in 1817.
The autumn of 1817 arrived in Robertson County the way autumn always did. The leaves turned copper and gold along the Red River bottomland. The tobacco harvest came in heavy and dark, the kind that would fetch good prices at market. The air turned crisp at night, perfect sleeping weather, the kind that made you pull quilts up to your chin and thank the Lord for the roof over your head. For John Bell, a man of 67 years who'd carved his farm from wilderness 13 years earlier, This should have been a season of satisfaction. His 320 acres produced some of the finest crops in the county. His children, 9 of them living, were healthy and strong. His wife Lucy, daughter of prominent North Carolina farmer John Williams, managed the household with quiet efficiency. John served as an elder at Red River Baptist Church, a position of respect in a community where church membership defined social standing. He owned slaves who worked his fields. He had achieved, by any measure available to a man on the Tennessee frontier in 1817, success. And then, on an otherwise unremarkable October afternoon, while inspecting a cornfield where blight had damaged several rows, John Bell saw something that would unravel everything. The creature sat among the cornstalks like it belonged there, like it had every right to occupy space in John Bell's world. It had the body of a dog, large and dark-furred, but where a dog's head should have been, there sat instead the head of a rabbit, oversized and wrong, with eyes that fixed on Bell with what he would later describe as intelligence. Not animal cunning, intelligence. John Bell was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was a farmer, a church elder, a man who dealt in tangible things, soil and seed and harvest. He raised his rifle, aimed carefully at center mass the way any sensible man would when confronted with a threat on his property, and fired. The shot echoed across the field, scattering crows from nearby trees. But the creature vanished. Not fled, vanished. One moment it occupied physical space, the next moment the space was empty, and John Bell stood alone in his cornfield with his rifle still raised and the acrid smell of gunpowder in his nostrils, trying to reconcile what he'd seen with what his rational mind knew to be possible. He told no one. What would he say? That he'd seen a rabbit-headed dog that disappeared when shot? Men had been called mad for less. So he kept silent, returned to the house, cleaned his rifle, and sat down to supper with his family as if nothing had happened. That night, the noises began. It started with knocking. Not the random settling of a house at night, not the wind rattling shutters, but deliberate knocking that moved along the outside walls of the Bell home in a pattern that suggested intention. John Bell rose from his bed, lit a lantern, and walked the perimeter of his house. Nothing. No one. The knocking continued, now coming from inside the walls themselves, a sound like knuckles rapping on wood from within the very structure of the house.
Over the following weeks, the phenomena escalated with a methodical quality that would have been almost admirable if it weren't so terrifying. The sounds diversified, scratching as if something with claws moved through the walls, gnawing, the unmistakable sound of teeth working on wood, loud enough to wake the children but never producing any visible damage. The sound of chains being dragged across floors, heavy iron links scraping across boards. But when the family investigated, they found nothing displaced, no marks, no explanation. Then came the voices, faint at first, barely audible whispers that might have been mistaken for wind if wind could form words. A woman's voice, old and raspy, muttering things just below the threshold of understanding. The Bell children, Jesse and John Jr. and Drury and the others, began waking in the night with their bed covers pulled off, lying exposed to the cold while something invisible tugged the quilts away, no matter how tightly they gripped them. Betsy, the youngest daughter at 12 years old, beautiful with her mother's features and her father's determination, became the focus of increasingly physical attacks. She would wake with her hair being yanked so hard it brought tears to her eyes. Invisible hands gripping and pulling until she cried out. Slaps appeared on her face, red marks forming on her cheeks while the family watched, helpless as something they could not see struck their daughter with enough force to leave evidence. John Bell's own body began to betray him. He experienced episodes where his tongue would swell and stiffen in his mouth, making speech impossible, making even swallowing difficult. The attacks came without warning and lasted minutes to hours, leaving him gasping and terrified. By early 1818, roughly 6 months after the creature in the cornfield, John Bell could no longer keep the secret. The phenomena had become too frequent, too violent, too witnessed by too many members of his household to be denied or explained away. He confided in James Johnston, a neighboring farmer and fellow church member, a man whose judgment Bell trusted. Johnston listened to Bell's account with the kind of careful attention a man gives to serious matters, and he made a proposal. He and his wife would spend several nights at the Bell home, bearing witness to whatever was happening, and together they would determine a course of action. The Johnstons arrived at the Bell farm prepared to be skeptical, prepared to find natural explanations for what the Bells believed was supernatural. They left 3 days later, shaken to their cores. They had witnessed the knockings, heard the chains, watched as bed covers were yanked from sleeping children by nothing visible. They had heard the whispers growing into words, a woman's voice speaking from thin air, mocking, threatening, sometimes singing hymns, in a voice James Johnston would later describe as beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Johnston made a recommendation that would prove fateful. The Bell family, he said, should not keep this secret any longer. They should invite others, men of learning and faith, to witness what was happening and offer their expertise. Perhaps a solution existed. Perhaps this thing, whatever it was, could be reasoned with or exercised or understood. John Bell resisted. To make this public would be to invite ridicule, to risk his standing in the community, to mark his family as cursed or insane. But the attacks were worsening. Betsy's face bore bruises now, finger marks appearing on her arms as if something grabbed her with physical hands. The voice was growing stronger, speaking in full sentences, threatening violence, promising death. And so, in the spring of 1818, word began to spread through Robertson County that something was happening at the Bell farm, something that defied explanation, something that anyone was welcome to come witness for themselves. They came in dozens at first, then hundreds. Farmers and merchants, preachers and skeptics, people from Nashville and beyond, camping on the Bell property with the family's permission, waiting through the nights to experience what the Bells called our family trouble. And the entity, whatever it was, performed for them. It knocked on command.
It answered questions. It sang hymns with a voice like an angel and cursed like a drunk sailor. It threw objects across rooms while dozens of witnesses watched, unable to explain how a candlestick could fly from one end of a room to the other with no visible cause. It slapped Betsy Bell in front of crowds, her cheek reddening from an invisible hand, while grown men stood helpless, unable to protect her from an enemy they could not see or fight. By the summer of 1818, the Bell Witch, as it was becoming known throughout Tennessee and beyond, was speaking freely, holding conversations with anyone who addressed it. And when asked who or what it was, when pressed for an identity, the voice gave an answer that would echo through centuries. It said it was Kate, the witch of Kate Batts. Kate Batts was real. She was a neighbor of the Bells, an eccentric woman whom many in the community avoided, a woman rumored to practice witchcraft, though no one could prove such claims. Kate Batts and John Bell had engaged in a business dispute, something involving a land transaction or the sale of a slave, the details changing depending on who told the story. Some said John Bell had cheated her. Others said she simply hated him for reasons of her own. Whatever the truth, the entity that tormented the Bell family claimed Kate Batts' identity, claimed to be her witch, her familiar spirit sent to exact revenge. The problem with this explanation was simple and damning. Kate Batts was still alive. She would, in fact, outlive John Bell by many years. Whatever haunted the Bell farm, it wasn't Kate Batts herself. Unless the living could somehow project their malice across distance, unless hatred could take physical form and torment a family while the hater went about her daily business miles away. But the name stuck, Kate. The Bell Witch became Kate, and Kate became the most documented supernatural entity in American history, a phenomenon that would draw the attention of generals and scholars, that would persist in the collective memory long after everyone involved was dead and buried.
By the autumn of 1818, the Bell Witch was no longer a family secret whispered about in hushed tones after church services. It was a spectacle, a phenomenon that drew visitors from across Tennessee and neighboring states, all arriving at the Bell farm with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. What they found when they arrived challenged every rational explanation they brought with them. The entity had evolved. Where once it merely knocked and scratched and pulled bed covers, it now engaged in complex interactions that suggested not just intelligence, but personality, wit, malice, and occasionally something that might have been mistaken for kindness if kindness could coexist with cruelty. The voice had strengthened from whispers to clear speech, a woman's voice that could modulate from angelic singing to guttural cursing, from educated discourse to vulgar mockery. Kate, as everyone now called it, would hold conversations that lasted hours. It demonstrated knowledge that seemed impossible for any living person to possess. On one famous occasion, it recited, word for word, 2 different sermons that had been delivered simultaneously in churches 13 miles apart. When challenged to explain how it could have heard both sermons at the same time, Kate simply laughed, that metallic, disembodied laugh that made grown men's skin crawl, and said she could be in multiple places at once, that distance meant nothing to something like her. visitors brought Bibles and crosses, holy water and prayers, attempting exorcisms and blessings with all the authority the church could muster. Kate mocked them. She would quote scripture back at ministers, correcting their interpretations, engaging in theological debates with a sophistication that left educated men sputtering. When one particularly determined preacher attempted to command the spirit to leave in the name of God, Kate responded by slapping him across the face hard enough to leave a handprint, then asked if he'd like her to quote some Old Testament passages about the Lord's angels of death. She seemed particularly well-versed in the more violent portions of Scripture. But Kate's most unsettling characteristic was her selectivity. While she tormented John Bell and Betsy mercilessly, she showed what could only be described as affection for Lucy Bell. She called Lucy the most perfect woman to walk the earth, and on multiple occasions she materialized gifts for her, hazelnuts and wild fruit appearing on Lucy's pillow, deposited there by invisible hands. When Lucy fell ill, Kate sang hymns to comfort her, that beautiful voice filling the house with sacred music that witnesses described as moving them to tears. This contradiction, this capacity for both violence and tenderness, made Kate impossible to categorize. She wasn't purely evil, wasn't a demon in the traditional sense. She had preferences, opinions, a moral framework that made sense to her, even if it baffled everyone else. And she had very specific goals. Two of them stated repeatedly with absolute clarity. First, she intended to kill John Bell. She said it often, without shame or hesitation. "I will kill old Jack Bell," the voice would announce, sometimes as a threat, sometimes as a simple statement of fact, as if his death was already written and she was merely informing him of the inevitable. Second, she would not allow Betsy Bell to marry Joshua Gardner. Joshua Gardner was everything a young man in early 19th century Tennessee should be. He came from a good family, owned land, was handsome and kind, and he loved Betsy Bell with the kind of devotion young love produces. They had known each other since childhood, had grown up together in the Red River community, and by 1818, when Betsy was 13, it was understood by both families that when she came of age, they would marry. Kate would not permit it. Whenever Joshua visited the Bell farm, Kate's torment of Betsy intensified. The slapping became more frequent. Betsy's hair would be yanked so violently that she would scream. Invisible hands would grab her arms hard enough to leave bruises, and the voice would plead, threaten, and curse, all focused on a single message. "Please, Betsy Bell, don't have Joshua Gardner." Why Kate opposed this union remained a mystery she refused to explain. When pressed, she would only say that Betsy must not marry Joshua, that it would be a mistake, that she would not allow it. Whether Kate had some insight into the future, whether she harbored her own reasons related to plans the Bell family couldn't fathom, or whether she simply enjoyed the cruelty of separating two people who loved each other, no one could say. The phenomenon attracted skeptics, of course, men who arrived at the Bell farm determined to expose what they believed must be an elaborate hoax. They left confused or converted. One man, a physician from Nashville who prided himself on his rationalism, spent a week at the property conducting experiments. He attempted to communicate with Kate using a system of knocks, establishing a code for yes and no answers. Kate played along, answering his questions with surprising patience. When he asked if she was the spirit of someone who had died, Kate knocked once for yes. When he asked if she had been murdered, she knocked twice for no. The physician expanded his questions, trying to trap the entity in contradictions or impossibilities. Kate never faltered. She answered complex mathematical problems instantly. She identified objects hidden in sealed boxes. She described events happening miles away, details that were later verified by witnesses. The physician left the Bell farm having written a lengthy report that essentially concluded he had no explanation for what he'd witnessed, that he had observed phenomena that violated every principle of natural philosophy he had studied, and that he could neither prove nor disprove that the Bell Witch was supernatural in origin, but he could not, in good conscience, call it a fraud. Then there were the personalities. By late 1818, Kate introduced what she called her family. 4 additional voices began to manifest alongside hers, each distinct, each with its own character. There was Black Dog, harsh and feminine, Mathematics and Psychopathy, delicate voices that spoke in riddles, and Jerusalem, who sounded like a young boy and rarely spoke at all. These 5 voices would sometimes argue among themselves, debating topics from scripture to politics, agreeing and disagreeing like any family might around a dinner table. Except this family existed only as voices in the air, invisible presences that somehow managed to drink whiskey, or at least produce the smell of it, and sing in harmony when the mood struck them. The most disturbing nights were when they got drunk. Kate claimed they raided a still house 4 miles away, and on those nights, the Bell home would reek of alcohol while the voices caroused, singing bawdy songs, making jokes, behaving like humans celebrating some victory. The Bell family and whoever happened to be staying at the farm those nights would huddle together, listening to invisible drunks carouse through their home, unable to stop it, unable to understand it. But these family gatherings didn't last. By early 1819, the 4 additional voices faded, leaving only Kate, who seemed to absorb all their characteristics, good and bad, becoming alternately pious and profane, helpful and harmful, wise and wicked. It was in the spring of 1819 that Andrew Jackson entered the story, or so the legend claims. Jackson, already famous for his victory at the Battle of New Orleans 4 years earlier, was not yet president, but commanded respect throughout Tennessee. He had land in Robertson County, and 3 of John Bell's sons had served under his command during the War of 1812. Whether Jackson visited the Bell farm out of loyalty to former soldiers, curiosity about the phenomena everyone was discussing, or simply because he enjoyed an adventure, the accounts agree on one thing. If he came, he left quickly. The most popular version of the story describes Jackson's wagon, loaded with camping equipment and provisions, becoming stuck on the road leading to the Bell property. Despite the horses straining and the men pushing, the wheels would not turn, as if the wagon had been nailed to the earth itself. Jackson, never a man to surrender easily, finally declared, "By the eternal, boys, this must be the witch." At which point, a voice from the woods responded, "All right, General, let the wagon move on. I will see you again tonight." The wagon moved. Jackson and his men made it to the Bell farm, set up camp, and that night, Kate made good on her promise. One of Jackson's companions, a man who claimed to be a witch layer, a professional exorcist of sorts, boasted that he had a silver bullet that would kill any evil spirit. Kate apparently took exception to this claim. The witch layer was reportedly grabbed by an invisible force, yanked around the room, slapped, kicked, and finally thrown out the door while he screamed for mercy. Jackson, watching this, allegedly said he'd rather face the entire British Army single-handed than spend another night at the Bell farm. By morning, he and his men were gone, though whether this story is true or embellished legend remains debated by historians. What isn't debated is that by the end of 1819, the Bell Witch was the most famous ghost in America, drawing comparison to nothing else in the historical record, a phenomenon that would be written about in newspapers from Tennessee to New England, discussed in parlors and universities, feared and marveled at in equal measure. And through it all, through the visitors and the investigations and the attempts to explain or exorcise, Kate remained focused on her two stated goals. John Bell's health continued to deteriorate. The swelling in his mouth came more frequently, lasting longer, leaving him unable to speak or eat for hours at a time. His body weakened, his weight dropped, his strength faded. And Betsy Bell, caught between love for Joshua Gardner and terror of the entity that tormented her, found herself trapped in a situation with no good outcome, watched by a community that pitied her but could offer no solution, haunted by something that would not negotiate, would not compromise, would not leave her in peace.
December 20th, 1820. Dawned cold and gray over Robertson County. Winter had settled into the Red River Valley, the kind of bone-deep cold that made farmers grateful for harvest already gathered, that made families pull closer to fires and count their blessings for roofs and walls and stored provisions that would see them through to spring. In the Bell household, John Bell did not rise from his bed. This in itself was not unusual. For months now, his condition had worsened. The mysterious illness that Kate claimed credit for had progressed to the point where days in bed outnumbered days on his feet. But this morning felt different. John Jr., the eldest son, who had taken over most responsibilities for running the farm, went to check on his father and found him unconscious, breathing shallow, unresponsive to voice or touch. In the cupboard where the family kept medicines, 3 vials that should have been there were gone. In their place sat a single vial, 1/3 full of a dark, smoky liquid that no one in the family recognized. John Jr. called for his mother, for his siblings, and within minutes the entire household had gathered in John Bell's room, staring at this mysterious vial, at their patriarch lying still as death in his bed. And they knew, all of them knew, what had happened even before Kate's voice filled the room. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere, that familiar metallic quality that had haunted them for 3 years. But this time it carried something new. Not anger, not menace, victory. "It's useless to investigate," Kate said, her voice almost cheerful. "I gave old Jack a big dose of that last night, out of that vial. He'll never get up from that bed again."
The family tried anyway. They sent for the doctor. They attempted to rouse John Bell, to administer what medicines they had, to pray over him with all the faith they could muster. But Kate was right. John Bell never regained consciousness. He died that morning with his family surrounding his bed, with Kate's voice singing in the background, a drunken celebration that made the scene even more grotesque. They tested the liquid in the mysterious vial on the family cat. The cat convulsed and died within minutes, confirming what everyone already suspected. John Bell had been poisoned. But by what? By whom? The vial's contents defied identification. Doctors who examined it could determine only that it was toxic, that it had killed a man and a cat, but its composition remained unknown. The vial disappeared shortly after John Bell's death, reportedly thrown into the fire where it burst with a blue flame that shot up the chimney, leaving no trace, no evidence, nothing that could be analyzed or explained. John Bell's funeral took place 3 days later at Red River Baptist Church, the same church where he had served as elder, where he had been respected and admired before the haunting began. The community turned out in force, hundreds of people gathering to pay their respects to a man whose life had been destroyed by something no one could understand or stop. And Kate attended the funeral. Everyone heard her. As the preacher delivered the eulogy, as Lucy Bell sat dry-eyed with grief beyond tears, as the Bell children tried to comprehend a world without their father, Kate sang.
Drunken hymns, slurred and mocking, filled the church. "Row me up some brandy, oh," the voice sang, a drinking song grotesquely inappropriate for a funeral, and there was nothing anyone could do to silence it. The voice followed the procession to the burial ground. It sang as they lowered John Bell's coffin into Tennessee soil. It celebrated its victory over a man it had sworn to kill. And it had succeeded, had accomplished what it set out to do, had tormented John Bell until his death, and then mocked him even in burial. Tennessee became the only state in the Union to officially recognize a death caused by supernatural means. The coroner's report listed John Bell's death as resulting from a divine visitation, which was as close as 19th century bureaucracy could come to admitting that something impossible had happened. This wasn't folklore. This was official state documentation acknowledging that a man had died from causes that defied natural explanation. After John Bell's death, Kate's activity diminished but did not cease. She remained at the Bell farm through the winter and spring of 1821, her presence less violent but still constant, still speaking, still making her wishes known. And her second goal remained unaccomplished. Betsy Bell and Joshua Gardner were still engaged. They had remained committed to each other through 3 years of Kate's opposition, through physical and psychological torment, through community pressure and family worry. Their love had endured, or at least they were both too stubborn to let Kate win. In the late spring of 1821, Betsy and Joshua attended a social gathering, one of those occasions where young people from neighboring farms would gather for an evening of carefully chaperoned interaction. They found a moment alone by the river, away from the crowd, and Joshua brought up the subject they had been avoiding: marriage. They couldn't continue like this indefinitely. Betsy would be 16 soon, old enough by the standards of the time to wed. Joshua wanted to set a date,
to make concrete plans, to move forward with their lives despite Kate's threats. But as they spoke, as Joshua held Betsy's hand and tried to reassure her that they could survive Kate's opposition together, the voice materialized between them. Not loud, not angry, sad, almost pleading. "Please, Betsy Bell," Kate said, the words hanging in the night air like smoke. "Don't have Joshua Gardner." Over and over, the voice repeated this phrase, this request that had become a command, had become the defining statement of 3 years of haunting. "Please, Betsy Bell, don't have Joshua Gardner." Betsy Bell was 16 years old. She had endured 3 years of physical abuse, of having her hair pulled and her face slapped, of being grabbed and pinched with pins by something she could not see or fight. She had watched her father waste away and die, had heard Kate sing drunkenly at his funeral. She had lived in constant terror, had been the focus of a malevolent entity's attention for reasons she did not understand and could not escape. And she broke. She removed the engagement ring from her finger. She handed it back to Joshua Gardner. She told him she could not marry him, that she was sorry, that she loved him but could not condemn him to a life with Kate as a constant presence. Joshua Gardner accepted the ring without argument. He understood. Everyone understood. Kate had won. Joshua Gardner left Robertson County shortly after. He moved west to Obion County, hundreds of miles away, and Betsy Bell never saw him again. He married someone else. She married someone else. Their paths diverged that night by the river, and Kate's second stated goal was accomplished. Within weeks of Betsy's broken engagement, Kate announced she was leaving. The voice, which had been constant for nearly 4 years, told the Bell family that her work was done, that she had accomplished what she set out to do, and she would depart for a time. She promised to return in 7 years, in 1828. Then the voice faded. The knockings stopped. The physical manifestations ceased. After 4 years of constant haunting, the Bell farm fell silent, and that silence felt more unsettling than the noise had been. The Bell family tried to resume normal life. Lucy Bell, widowed at 56, remained on the property with her younger children. The older sons managed the farm. Betsy, free from Kate's physical abuse, but carrying scars both visible and invisible, began a courtship with Richard Powell, her former schoolteacher, a man 11 years her senior, who had expressed interest in her for some time. Powell had been present during much of the haunting, had witnessed Kate's manifestations, and he claimed never to have experienced the spirit himself, which some found curious given that Kate interacted with nearly everyone else who spent time at the Bell farm. Betsy married Powell in 1824. They moved to Mississippi, away from Tennessee, away from the memories, away from the place where something impossible had destroyed her father and stolen her first love. By all accounts, Kate never bothered Betsy again after her marriage to Powell, which led to speculation about whether Powell himself had been involved in the haunting, whether he had manipulated events to remove his romantic rival and win Betsy for himself. Some theories suggest Powell knew hypnosis and ventriloquism, that he had access to the Bell home through secret corridors his father had built, that he staged the haunting as an elaborate scheme. But these theories struggle to explain the hundreds of witnesses, the physical phenomena observed by skeptics and believers alike, the sheer scope and duration of events that would require dozens of accomplices maintaining perfect secrecy for years. The truth, if there is a singular truth, remains elusive. Kate kept her promise to return. In February 1828, exactly 7 years after her departure, Lucy Bell and her sons Richard and Joel reported that the phenomena returned. Shakings of beds, unexplained noises, the familiar patterns of Kate's presence. But this second visitation was brief, a whisper compared to the howl of the original haunting. It lasted only a few weeks, and then Kate departed again. Before she left, she made one final promise. She would return to haunt the Bell descendants in 107 years. The date she gave was either 1935 or 1937, depending on which account you trust, which version of the story survived through decades of retelling. But everyone in Adams, Tennessee knew the appointed time was approaching. Everyone knew that Kate had kept her promises before. She had promised to kill John Bell, and he had died mysteriously. She had promised to stop Betsy's marriage to Joshua Gardner, and that engagement had ended. She had promised to return in 7 years, and she had returned. So when the 1930s arrived, when the Great Depression squeezed rural Tennessee like a vice, when young people who had grown up hearing their grandparents' stories about the Bell Witch began to wonder if the legend might manifest again, the question wasn't whether Kate would return. The question was what she would do when she did. Because something that keeps promises, something that accomplishes stated goals with methodical precision, something that can kill a man and break up a romance and vanish for decades only to return exactly when it said it would, that kind of something doesn't make idle threats. And 1937 was coming. The world changed more in the century between Kate's departure and her promised return than it had in all the centuries before. In 1821, when the voice faded from the Bell farm and silence finally settled over that haunted property, Andrew Jackson was still 4 years away from becoming president. The Monroe Doctrine hadn't been articulated. Texas belonged to Mexico. California belonged to Spain. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the North while the South remained stubbornly agrarian, its economy built on cotton and tobacco and the backs of enslaved people whose labor generated wealth they would never share. Tennessee in 1821 was still frontier in many ways, still rough around the edges, still a place where wolves howled in the night, and native peoples, though pushed westward by treaties that were really ultimatums, remained within living memory of most settlers. Adams was a cluster of farms surrounding a church, connected to other settlements by roads that turned to soup when it rained, where news traveled slowly and life moved at the pace of seasons and harvests. By 1937, that world was unrecognizable. The United States had fought a civil war that killed more Americans than all other American wars combined. Slavery had ended, at least in law, if not in practice, replaced by sharecropping and Jim Crow, systems that kept former slaves and their descendants in economic bondage under different names. The nation had expanded to the Pacific, had fought wars in Cuba and the Philippines, had sent millions of young men to die in the trenches of France in a war that was supposed to end all wars, but only planted seeds for another. The automotive had replaced the horse. Electricity had replaced candlelight. Radio brought voices from hundreds of miles away into living rooms. Airplanes crossed oceans. The world had become smaller and faster, and rural Tennessee, while slower to change than the industrial North, couldn't escape the transformation entirely. But for Tennessee farmers, particularly those in Robertson County who still worked the same tobacco fields their grandfathers had cleared, the 20th century arrived with more suffering than promise. Agricultural prices had collapsed after World War I ended, never recovering from the highs of wartime demand. Through the 1920s, while cities boomed and jazz played and stock prices climbed, rural Tennessee quietly starved. Farm output grew too fast in most crops, glutting markets and driving prices down. Small farms were being squeezed by larger operations, by merchant middlemen and railroads, drowning in debt for land and machinery and fertilizer they couldn't afford not to buy, but couldn't make back through sales of crops that weren't worth what they cost to grow. Wikipedia, barn raiser, the average Tennessee farmer in 1929 was already in crisis when the stock market crashed that October.
What came after? What the rest of the nation experienced as the Great Depression was for farmers simply an intensification of hardship they'd been enduring for a decade. Cotton that had sold for 35 cents a pound in 1919 fetched only 6 cents in 1931. Tobacco prices followed the same brutal trajectory. National farm income fell from a high of $16.9 billion in 1919 to only $5.3 billion in 1932. Wikipedia. Banks failed across rural Tennessee, taking with them the savings of families who had worked their entire lives to accumulate what little they had. Foreclosures became epidemic. Families who had owned land for generations found themselves evicted, turned out onto roads with whatever they could carry, joining the migration of displaced people moving west or into cities in search of work that mostly didn't exist. For 3 years before the Depression officially began, much of the South had been plagued by severe drought. An already dreadful problem became acute. Prices of cotton and tobacco, Tennessee's biggest cash crops, plummeted further. Small farmers who owned their land managed to survive by eating what they grew, parsing out expenditures, doing without. Many children who had gone to cities returned to farms when their livelihoods disappeared. Wikipedia, Adams in the 1930s looked superficially similar to Adams in the 1820s. The same rolling hills and the same Red River winding through limestone valleys. The same church steeples marking communities. But the similarities were surface deep. The people who worked these farms in 1937 were connected to a larger world in ways their ancestors couldn't have imagined. They listened to radio broadcasts from Nashville. They read newspapers that reported events from Europe, where another war was brewing, where a man named Hitler was consolidating power in Germany, with rhetoric about racial purity and national destiny that should have terrified anyone paying attention. They drove automobiles, though gas cost money many didn't have. They had telephones, those who could afford the service. They lived in a world where information moved at the speed of electricity, where the impossible seemed to happen daily, where men flew across oceans and voices traveled through air without wires.
This connectivity, this exposure to modernity, should have made the old superstitions obsolete. Ghost stories belonged to the previous century, to a time before science explained the world, before rational thought replaced folk belief. But the Bell Witch refused to fade. If anything, the legend grew stronger as the decades passed.
Martin V. Ingram had published his Authenticated History of the Bell Witch in 1894, codifying the oral traditions into a text that could be distributed, read, discussed, debated. The book sold well, going through multiple printings, carrying the legend beyond Tennessee into the broader American consciousness. By the 1920s and 30s, the Bell Witch was known across the nation, referenced in newspaper articles and magazine features, discussed by folklorists and anthropologists who studied American mythology. Hollywood had discovered horror, had made movies about Dracula and Frankenstein, had shown that audiences would pay to be frightened. And the Bell Witch seemed ready-made for cinematic treatment, though no film would materialize for decades. In Adams itself, the legend lived in a more immediate way. The Bell Farm still existed, though it had changed hands several times since Lucy Bell died in 1838. The Bell Witch Cave, a limestone cavern on the property, had become central to the legend, despite playing little role in the original haunting. The cave was mysterious, as caves are, dark and deep, the kind of place that invites speculation about what might hide in shadows beyond lantern light. Local teenagers dared each other to enter the cave, to call out Kate's name, to tempt fate in the way young people do when testing boundaries between childhood and adulthood. Sometimes people claimed to experience phenomena in or near the cave, strange sounds, cold spots, feelings of being watched. Whether these experiences were genuine, whether they represented some residual energy from the original haunting, or whether they were products of expectation and imagination working on nervous systems primed by a century of ghost stories, no one could say definitively. What mattered was that the legend persisted, that generation after generation of Robertson County residents grew up knowing the story, that the Bell Witch remained a living presence in community consciousness, even as the world modernized around them. And everyone knew about the promise. Kate had said she would return in 107 years. Or was it 110? Or 105? The exact number varied depending on who told the story, but the consensus pointed to the 1930s. Some said 1935. Others said 1937. A few claimed 1938. But everyone agreed the appointed time was approaching, that the century of Kate's absence was ending, and that if she kept her promises the way she had before, then something was going to happen. The question was what, and whether anyone in Adams was ready for it.
January 3rd, 1937. T.H. Alexander, a Nashville journalist, writing his syndicated column, I Reckon So, for the Tennessean, raised a specter that had been dormant for a century. His writing partner, Ben Bass, had unearthed a startling fact during research for a magazine feature on the Bell Witch. The famous poltergeist of Tennessee was practically certain to return to this earth in this good year, 1937. According to Alexander's timeline, the Bell Witch had vowed in 1828 to return in 107 years. Tennessee history. The column ran in newspapers across Tennessee and beyond. Within days, what had been local folklore known primarily to Robertson County residents became a statewide, then nationwide story. Other journalists picked up the thread, writing their own pieces about America's most famous ghost story and its promised return. In April, a journalist for the Central Press News Syndicate reported from Adams that many Negroes and some superstitious whites of this community are worried over the predicted return this year of the Bell Witch. Tennessee history. The characterization was condescending, dismissive, the kind of thing a modern, educated journalist would write about backward rural people who still believed in ghosts. But the worry was real. People who had grown up hearing their grandparents tell Bell Witch stories, people who knew descendants of families who had witnessed the original haunting, people who had lived their entire lives in Adams and felt connected to the land and its history in ways outsiders couldn't understand, these people took the promise seriously. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough that when strange things began happening in the spring and summer of 1937, when unexplained phenomena started being reported, the Bell Witch became the immediate explanation, and the fear that had gripped the community in 1817 began to resurface. In August, residents described a series of eerie incidents to Jack Tucker, a staff correspondent for the Tennessean. Strange noises from Bell Witch Cave, a mysteriously emptied corn sack, blackouts and broken beds, scattered feathers from unknown chickens. Tennessee history. Lewis Garrison, who owned the farm that included the Bell Witch Cave, reported hearing unexplained sounds coming from inside the cavern, noises that didn't match anything that should naturally occur in a cave. When he investigated, he found nothing that could explain the sounds. Bell descendants described the sound of something rubbing against a house, a paper-like object that flew out the door and re-entered through a side door, and faint music heard from a piano. Wikipedia. Each incident, taken individually, could be explained away. An animal in the cave, wind creating acoustic illusions, a piece of debris caught in an updraft, the mind playing tricks. But taken together, a pattern seemed to emerge, a sense that something was indeed happening, that Kate was making her presence known in subtle ways, testing the waters perhaps, seeing if anyone remembered, if anyone cared, if anyone would notice. The community noticed. Several spectators traveled from surrounding counties to investigate the alleged haunting, including a Hopkinsville magician with plans to spend a night in the haunted cave and capture the ghost on film. Tennessee history. The Hopkinsville magician's attempt apparently yielded nothing. At least, nothing he was willing to share with the press. But his willingness to try reflected how seriously people outside Adams took the Bell Witch legend. This wasn't just local folklore anymore. This was news. Nashville embraced the spectacle. In June, Nashville's WSM radio station broadcast The Bell Witch of Tennessee, a special 40-minute dramatization written by Bell Witch enthusiast Marshall Morgan, with over 40 voice actors and musicians. Tennessee history. Thousands of Tennesseans tuned in to hear a radio play recreating the haunting, complete with sound effects and dramatic performances that brought Kate's voice to life for a new generation. Alexander publicized the production in his column, along with his and Bass's story in the July issue of Coronet magazine, entitled Bell Witch, America's #1 Ghost Story. The Nashville Princess Theater, sensing commercial opportunity, staged the return of the Bell Witch on Halloween night, drawing crowds who wanted to experience the legend through theater. Alexander branded 1937, the year of the witch. Tennessee history, and the name stuck. For 12 months, Tennessee was obsessed with a ghost story that refused to stay buried, a legend that had transcended its origins to become part of the cultural fabric. But it was the Wiener Roast that everyone remembered. July 29, 1937. A group from the local Epworth League attended a Wiener Roast in a rock quarry near the Bell Witch Cave. The Epworth League was a Methodist youth organization. Young people from good Christian families, not the kind of kids who went looking for trouble. They gathered at the quarry with hot dogs and sticks and the kind of innocent intentions young people bring to summer evenings. They joked about the legend. Someone dared someone else to call out Kate's name. They laughed because that's what you do when you're young and with friends and the world seems manageable, when ghost stories are entertainment rather than threat. Then they saw the figure of a woman sitting on top of the cliff overlooking the cave. Not moving, just sitting, watching them. The laughter stopped. One of them pointed. Others looked. They all saw it. The figure of a woman silhouetted against the summer sky, perched on rock above the cave entrance. They ran. Not all at once. The first to flee broke the spell, and then others followed, scrambling over rocks, dropping their hot dogs and sticks, their hearts hammering as they bolted toward the road that led back to Adams. A minister in the group later claimed to have investigated and discovered it was moonlight on a rock. This became the official explanation, the rational account that newspapers would report, the story that people who didn't want to believe in ghosts could accept. Just moonlight.
Just a trick of shadow and stone. Nothing supernatural, nothing to fear. But there were problems with this explanation. The second newspaper report concluded with a weather report that the moon was barely noticeable that night. Wikipedia, if the moon was obscured by cloud cover, then what light source could have created the illusion? And why would a minister, a man of God and reason, have run to catch up with the fleeing youth rather than calmly walking back to tell them what he'd discovered? Jim Brooks published in 2015 that his mother was in attendance at the roast, and she related that the minister caught up to the youth on the road. Wikipedia, he didn't slowly follow, he caught up, which suggests he left that cliff quickly, suggests that whatever he found, or didn't find, or experienced, had unsettled him enough that he wanted to be away from that place as fast as his legs could carry him. What actually happened on July 29, 1937 at the Bell Witch Cave? Did Kate return as promised, manifesting visually to a group of young people who had the misfortune to be at the right place at the right time? Was it mass hysteria, one person's fear triggering a cascade reaction that convinced everyone they saw something that wasn't there? Was it a prank, someone from the community playing dress-up to frighten kids who should have known better than to joke about Kate? Was it moonlight on rock, a perfectly natural phenomenon misinterpreted by nervous teenagers primed by a year of Bell Witch publicity to see ghosts where none existed? Or was it something else entirely? Something that defies categories, that exists in the space between rational explanation and supernatural belief? The witnesses never changed their stories. Decades later, those who survived to be interviewed maintained they had seen the figure of a woman on that cliff. The minister never elaborated. If he had climbed that cliff and found nothing, if he had examined the rock formation and determined it was a natural phenomenon, then why the rush to leave? Why the look in his eyes that the others noted? The expression that suggested he had encountered something that shook his certainties? Adams spent the remainder of 1937. As the year came to a close, fewer stories about the Bell Witch appeared in the paper. By December, Bell Witch mania had passed without any proof of paranormal activity, leaving one reporter to suggest that the ghost must have forgotten all about its fated return. Or perhaps Kate had returned exactly as she promised, had shown herself to those young people at the cave, had kept her word in the most literal way possible, and then, satisfied that she demonstrated she could still reach across the divide between whatever realm she inhabited and the world of the living, had departed again, leaving Adams to wonder, leaving questions unanswered, leaving the legend stronger than ever, because now it wasn't just a 19th century ghost story. Now it was a 20th century encounter witnessed by living people, people who would carry their experience into the future, who would tell their children and grandchildren, who would ensure that the Bell Witch legend survived into another century and beyond. The Bell Witch didn't end in 1937 any more than it ended in 1821. Legends don't end. They evolve. They adapt. They find new generations to haunt, new mediums through which to propagate, new reasons to matter to people who weren't alive when the original events occurred, but who recognize something in the story that speaks to universal human experiences: fear and loss, injustice and inexplicability, the terror of realizing that the world might not operate according to rules we understand or can control. What happened at the Bell Farm between 1817 and 1821, and what may or may not have happened at the Bell Witch Cave in 1937, became source material for an American mythology that has endured for over 2 centuries. The story has been retold in books and films, investigated by paranormal researchers, analyzed by folklorists and historians, appropriated by the tourism industry, and debated endlessly by people trying to determine what actually happened versus what legend claims happened. The truth, if there is a singular truth, has become inseparable from the myth. Richard Williams Bell, John Bell's son, who was only 6 years old during the original haunting, wrote an account titled Our Family Trouble sometime in the 1840s, roughly 24 years after the events. This manuscript, if it ever existed, has never been found. Martin V. Ingram claimed to have based his 1894 book on Richard's manuscript. But skeptics point out that no one has ever seen this supposed primary source except Ingram, and that Ingram has been caught fabricating or embellishing other aspects of his account. Does this mean the Bell Witch was entirely invented? That nothing happened? That the hundreds of witnesses who supposedly experienced the phenomena were all lying or mistaken or caught up in mass delusion? The historical record suggests otherwise. John Bell was a real person who died on December 20th, 1820. Tennessee officially recognized his death as caused by supernatural means, the only such recognition in American history. This is documented. This happened. Whether you believe the supernatural cause is literal, or whether you think it reflects the limitations of early 19th century understanding, doesn't change the fact that something occurred that the state of Tennessee felt compelled to acknowledge in official records. The Bell Witch didn't end in 1937, any more than it ended in 1821. Legends don't end. They evolve. They adapt. They find new generations to haunt, new mediums through which to propagate, new reasons to matter to people who weren't alive when the original events occurred, but who recognize something in the story that speaks to universal human experiences: fear and loss, injustice and inexplicability, the terror of realizing that the world might not operate according to rules we understand or can control. What happened at the Bell Farm between 1817 and 1821, and what may or may not have happened at the Bell Witch Cave in 1937, became source material for an American mythology that has endured for over 2 centuries. The story has been retold in books and films, investigated by paranormal researchers, analyzed by folklorists and historians, appropriated by the tourism industry, and debated endlessly by people trying to determine what actually happened versus what legend claims happened. The truth, if there is a singular truth, has become inseparable from the myth. Richard Williams Bell, John Bell's son, who was only 6 years old during the original haunting, wrote an account titled Our Family Trouble sometime in the 1840s, roughly 24 years after the events. This manuscript, if it ever existed, has never been found. Martin V. Ingram claimed to have based his 1894 book on Richard's manuscript. But skeptics point out that no one has ever seen this supposed primary source except Ingram, and that Ingram has been caught fabricating or embellishing other aspects of his account. Does this mean the Bell Witch was entirely invented? That nothing happened? That the hundreds of witnesses who supposedly experienced the phenomena were all lying or mistaken or caught up in mass delusion? The historical record suggests otherwise. John Bell was a real person who died on December 20th, 1820. Tennessee officially recognized his death as caused by supernatural means, the only such recognition in American history. This is documented. This happened. Whether you believe the supernatural cause is literal, or whether you think it reflects the limitations of early 19th century understanding, doesn't change the fact that something occurred that the state of Tennessee felt compelled to acknowledge in official records. Betsy Bell was a real person who broke off her engagement to Joshua Gardner and later married Richard Powell. Joshua Gardner left Robertson County and never returned. These are facts. The Bell Farm existed. Red River Baptist Church existed and still exists. Adams, Tennessee is a real place where real people have lived for over 200 years. And the Bell Witch legend has been part of that community's identity since before most residents' great-great-grandparents were born. Betsy Bell was a real person who broke off her engagement to Joshua Gardner and later married Richard Powell. Joshua Gardner left Robertson County and never returned. These are facts. The Bell Farm existed. Red River Baptist Church existed and still exists. Adams, Tennessee is a real place where real people have lived for over 200 years. And the Bell Witch legend has been part of that community's identity since before most residents' great-great-grandparents were born.
The Bell Witch Cave became central to the legend in the 20th century, despite playing minimal role in the original 1817 to 1821 haunting. The cave is real, a limestone cavern approximately 490 feet long, located on property once owned by the Bell family. It's privately owned and operated as a tourist attraction, offering tours during summer months and in October, catering to people who want to experience the location where Kate supposedly fled when she left the Bell household. Whether the cave truly served as Kate's refuge, whether it has any genuine supernatural significance, or whether it's simply a natural formation that got folded into the legend because caves are spooky and legends need physical anchors, remains open to interpretation. But people have experiences there. Tour guides report phenomena. Visitors claim to feel presences, to hear sounds, to witness objects moving without apparent cause. Are these experiences real? Are they products of expectation? People primed by the legend to interpret natural cave phenomena as supernatural? Are they genuine encounters with whatever energy might linger in that place? The answer depends on your worldview, on whether you believe the material world is all that exists, or whether you accept the possibility of realms beyond what science can currently measure. The Bell Witch entered popular culture in ways the Bell family could never have imagined. Films have been made, some claiming to be based on true events, others using the legend as loose inspiration. And American Haunting, released in 2005, dramatized the story with Donald Sutherland as John Bell and Sissy Spacek as Lucy. The film took liberties with the legend, adding modern psychological interpretations and twists that historians and Bell Witch purists found frustrating. But it introduced the story to audiences who might never have encountered it otherwise. The Blair Witch Project, the 1999 found-footage horror film that revolutionized independent cinema and launched an entire subgenre, drew inspiration from the Bell Witch legend, though the filmmakers created their own mythology rather than directly adapting the Tennessee story. The connection is there, in the name, in the concept of a witch haunting the American wilderness, in the blurring of legend and reality that makes audiences question what they're seeing. Books continue to be published, some scholarly, attempting to separate fact from fiction through careful historical research, others embracing the supernatural elements without apology, still others trying to find middle ground, acknowledging the mystery while refusing to commit to either rational or paranormal explanations. Paranormal investigation teams visit the Bell Witch Cave regularly, equipped with EMF detectors and digital recorders and infrared cameras, tools that didn't exist in 1817 or 1937, but that modern ghost hunters believe can capture evidence of supernatural activity. Some claim to have recorded EVPs, electronic voice phenomena, sounds that weren't audible during recording but appear when audio is played back, whispers and words that might be Kate speaking from beyond. Others report electromagnetic anomalies, temperature drops, equipment malfunctions that suggest interference from sources they can't identify. Skeptics dismiss this as confirmation bias,
people finding what they expect to find, misinterpreting natural phenomena through the lens of belief in the supernatural. And the debate continues, as it has for over 200 years, with no resolution in sight, because the evidence, such as it is, allows multiple interpretations and satisfies no one completely. What makes the Bell Witch unique among American ghost stories is its documentation. Most hauntings are poorly recorded, based on hearsay and third-hand accounts, impossible to verify or investigate with any rigor. The Bell Witch was witnessed by hundreds of people, many of whom left written records. Andrew Jackson may or may not have visited the Bell Farm, but the fact that the story of his visit exists, that people contemporary to the events believed it happened, tells you something about how seriously the haunting was taken. This wasn't just backwoods superstition. This was a phenomenon that attracted attention from respected members of society, from educated people who had every reason to be skeptical, but who came away unable to explain what they'd witnessed. The legacy of the Bell Witch extends beyond paranormal investigation and horror entertainment. The story has become part of Tennessee's cultural identity, a piece of state history taught in schools, referenced in tourism materials, celebrated in local festivals. Adams has embraced the legend, recognizing that the Bell Witch puts their tiny town on the map in ways that tobacco farming never could. The cave attracts visitors from across the country, from around the world, people who want to stand in the place where Kate supposedly made her home, who want to feel whatever might linger there, who want to connect with a story that has survived centuries. And Kate's promise of a second return hangs in the air, unacknowledged but present.
She said she would come back in 107 years, which, depending on which date you accept as the starting point, means she was supposed to return again in 2044 or 2045. We're approaching that date now. Will anything happen? Will strange phenomena be reported in Adams, Tennessee in the 2040s? Will a new generation experience what the Bell family experienced in the 18-teens, and what the Epworth League members claimed to experience in 1937? Or will the date pass without incident, proving definitively that the legend is just a legend, that whatever happened historically has no power to repeat itself, that ghosts, if they exist at all, don't keep appointments made a century in advance? The Bell Witch matters not because we can prove it was real or fake, but because the story asks fundamental questions about reality, about what we're willing to believe, about how we construct meaning from events that defy easy explanation. It forces us to confront the limits of rationalism, to acknowledge that the scientific method, powerful as it is, cannot answer every question or explain every phenomenon. It reminds us that mystery still exists in the world, that despite our technology and knowledge, despite our ability to split atoms and map genomes and send robots to Mars, we still don't understand everything. And maybe that's okay. Maybe the world needs legends like the Bell Witch, needs stories that resist definitive explanation, that allow for multiple interpretations, that keep alive a sense of wonder and fear and possibility. Because the alternative? A world where everything is explained and categorized and reduced to data points, where mystery has been eliminated and every question has a definitive answer, might be a world where something essential about human experience has been lost. The Bell Witch endures because it speaks to something deep in us, some part of the human psyche that needs to believe the universe is larger and stranger than we can fully comprehend. Whether Kate exists as a literal supernatural entity or as a cultural phenomenon that reflects collective anxieties and desires doesn't ultimately matter. What matters is that people continue to tell the story, continue to visit Adams, Tennessee, continue to wonder about what happened in that farmhouse 2 centuries ago and what might happen in the future. The legend lives because we keep it alive, because each generation finds new reasons to care about the Bell Witch, new ways to interpret the events, new technologies through which to investigate, and new media through which to share. And as long as people gather around campfires or computer screens to tell ghost stories, as long as we're drawn to tales of the inexplicable and the terrifying, the Bell Witch will remain America's most famous haunting, the ghost that refuses to be forgotten, the legend that transcends time and continues to haunt not just a family or a community, but an entire nation's imagination. And that brings us to the end of our journey through one of America's most enduring mysteries. From the autumn night in 1817, when John Bell first saw that impossible creature in his cornfield, through 4 years of torment that ended with his death and his daughter's heartbreak, through a century of waiting and wondering, to that summer evening in 1937, when a figure appeared on a cliff and sent a group of young people running in terror, to today, where the legend continues to fascinate and frighten in equal measure. The Bell Witch has proven itself to be more than just a ghost story. It's a piece of American history, a cultural phenomenon, a mystery that refuses to be solved. So, what do you think? Was Kate real? Did something supernatural haunt the Bell family? Or can the events be explained through psychology, fraud, mass hysteria, and the human tendency to find patterns in chaos? Did she return in 1937 as promised? Will she return again in 2044? We can't answer these questions definitively, and maybe that's exactly as it should be. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Bell Witch legend, do us a favor. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future documentaries exploring the strange, the mysterious, and the unexplained corners of history. Drop a like if this story gave you chills or made you think. And most importantly, join the conversation in the comments below. Tell us what you believe about the Bell Witch. Share your own encounters with the unexplained. Let us know what historical mysteries you'd like us to investigate next. This channel exists because of viewers like you who share our fascination with the stories that refuse to be forgotten. Until next time, remember that history is full of questions that have no easy answers. And sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones that keep us wondering long after they've ended. This is the story of the Bell Witch. This is the legend that haunts America. And whether you believe or not, you have to admit, it's one hell of a story.